Good morning, actually good afternoon to our attendees from APAC. We have a new session coming. It's titled, When Cybersecurity Teams Tells You That You Are Protected, Start Worrying. How Hardware Access Control Aspects of Your Cybersecurity Posture. So we have with us Jessica Amado from Sepio System. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Well, not too bad, not too bad. Thank you for joining us, and apologies for the 4 minutes delay. We have an overrun meeting. So we are very excited about your session. This title, When Your Cybersecurity Team Tells You That You Are Protected, Start Worrying. Hardware Access Control Aspects to Your Cybersecurity Posture. Very suggesting title. So we are very excited about that. Benzi introduced the topic yesterday into the email track of this event. So we want to know more about that. So I'm fully ready to mute myself and to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me and giving us the opportunity today. So let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay. So I am Jessie. I'm the head of cyber research at Sepio Systems. And today I'm just going to give a talk on hardware access control, more specifically, when your cybersecurity team tells you that you're protected, start worrying. So organizations today are facing two main challenges. The first is the lack of hardware visibility, and the second is the lack of hardware access control. So in terms of visibility, if something is not visible, you are not protected from it. And when we say visibility, we mean actual visibility. When it comes to hardware attacks, network implants actually sit on the physical layer, and the physical layer is the layer of the OSI layers that is not currently covered by any existing security software solutions. So they actually go by undetected. On the other side of hardware attacks, there are spoof peripherals, which are able to impersonate legitimate HIDs. And there is no security software that can actually differentiate a legitimate HID from that of an impersonating device. So there are a lot of myths that come with visibility. We hear security teams tell us that they have their USB connection blocked, but when we ask them how their keyboards and mice are connected to the endpoint, their answer is always USB, which means that the organization is actually vulnerable. We also hear security teams tell us that they have security measures in place, but hardware attack tools are actually extremely sophisticated and have the ability to bypass biometric authentication, air gap networks, and other security features. So they are essentially ineffective when it comes to hardware attacks. Other times, security teams don't actually believe that this problem affects them. The security team obviously will protect the organization from the vulnerabilities that they think they have. So if they don't believe that they are vulnerable to this, then of course, they don't provide protection for this. So these myths actually result in blind spots that the attackers seek to exploit. Attackers know their enemies really well. They know everything about the organization that they're targeting, which security features they have, where the vulnerabilities are, and this is exactly where they seek to target the organization. They gather this information through reconnaissance phase, whether that be through open sources or actually engaging in social engineering techniques to find out more about the organization. So here, as you can see on the OSI layers, the physical layer is not covered. So of course, this is exactly where the attackers are going to go. So with the lack of visibility, you're essentially welcoming attackers with open arms. So here are some of the attack tools. As you can see, just by looking at them, they're extremely unsuspecting to the human eye. The bottom left down here, the USB Ninja cable looks like a regular USB iPhone charger. The USB rubber ducky looks like any other USB device. So just to the human eye, these devices are unsuspecting, but they also actually run below the radar of endpoint and network security solutions. So this makes them extremely attractive to attackers. Even more so, they're low cost and they're also easily accessible. You can buy them on Amazon, AliExpress. So you don't see a sophisticated state-sponsored attacking group to actually get your hands on these devices, nor do you need significant investments. So depending on the device's capability, there are a range of attacks that can be carried out. On the network implant side, state-sponsored groups often use these devices for espionage purposes. They can engage in network packet sniffing. Sometimes attackers might be financially motivated and use these devices for man-in-the-middle attacks. We often see these network implants attached to ATMs because the attacker can actually send cash dispensing commands to the ATMs and gain financial rewards. Spoof peripherals, as I mentioned, they're impersonating devices, so they can actually emulate a keyboard, and this gives them the ability to carry out data theft. A large US agency was actually attacked a couple of years ago with a hardware attack tool, and the attackers were able to gain access to 500 megabytes of data. Again, with keyboard emulation, the attacker can inject malware, worms, viruses, into the target. And this is actually how the Stuxnet worm ended up in the Iranian nuclear facility. So why is visibility so important? This is because if you can't see something, you can't control it. And this brings us to the next vulnerability, which is a lack of hardware access control. So this usually comes from a lack of policy enforcement. And the lack of policy enforcement brings about numerous vulnerabilities to the organization. So there are more entry points of the attacker because there is a larger attack surface. Hardware attacks require the attacker gaining physical access in some way. So the vulnerabilities actually extend beyond the office. And I'll go into these vulnerabilities in just a minute. So with a greater attack surface, the risk increases for the organization. The security team has a larger task at hand. They have to make sure that all their vulnerabilities are covered, whereas the attacker needs to exploit just one. So the attacker in this case is obviously at an advantage. Because of this, these hardware attacks actually are extremely attractive to attackers due to the easy access. There's no policy enforcement in place monitoring them or blocking these attacks from being carried out. They're also low risk due to not being detected. It's very difficult for the attacker to get caught. And these attacks bring high rewards because of the inability for organizations to detect these attacks. They can actually persist for long periods of time, and they can be extremely harmful to the victim. So this brings greater rewards to the perpetrator. Finally, a lack of hardware access control brings about mitigation challenges for the organization. Sometimes when an attack is detected, it's not actually identified as a hardware attack because there's no mechanism in place to identify this. If the attack is identified as originating from a hardware tool, there's a huge challenge of locating the source, because when it comes to hardware attacks, not every device would have been manipulated. It will be 1, 2, maybe even a few. But this requires a manual inspection of every device to actually locate the source. Then there's the challenge of identifying the perpetrator. If the device, the source of the attack is actually identified, then there's the challenge of identifying the actual perpetrator. Without hardware access control measures in place, it's extremely difficult to identify where or how or who brought the device into the organization. So here are some of the vulnerabilities that come with a lack of hardware access control. There are more, but these are just the 6 main ones that I will go into today. So the first is people. So insiders are one of the greatest threats to organizations in general. 60% of cyber attacks are actually carried out by insiders. You have different types of insiders. So the first are malicious insiders. This could be a disgruntled employee who's seeking revenge. It could be an activist who disagrees with the agenda or the general policies of the organization. Edward Snowden is a really famous example of this. or it simply could be an attacker seeking financial rewards. But when it comes to hardware attacks, malicious insiders are extremely threatening because they, of course, have the insider, they have the physical access, and they also know all of the organization's vulnerabilities. The next type of internal abuser is the unaware employee. So these employees are extremely susceptible to social engineering techniques. When it comes to hardware attacks, social engineering techniques are extremely deceptive that even employees with training and awareness of social engineering in general are still extremely susceptible to these techniques. As I mentioned, in hardware attacks, the attacker might deploy social engineering techniques in the reconnaissance phase, but also in the attack itself. The requirement of physical access means that attackers rely very heavily on these types of techniques to gain that physical access, whether it be to the organization itself, through evil mail attacks, or dressing up as somebody that looks important, or pretending to be an outsourced organization, maybe a maintenance company. So that can give them access to the organization itself. In other instances, the attacker simply needs access to an employee or a device. So they might actually target maybe a coffee shop near the organization they wish to infiltrate, hand out free iPhone chargers, which are actually have been manipulated. And the hope is that eventually an employee will actually walk into that coffee shop and take one of the chargers and use it in the organization. So unsecure devices are another risk that come with unaware employees. Of course, there's that risk of using the freebies in the coffee shop, but also simply just using devices that they've bought on Amazon for a low cost. They might look good, like a nice neon keyboard, but actually these devices could be vulnerable or even manipulated. Then you have your negligent staff who just engage in poor cyber hygiene practices. Things like unlocking their endpoints can be a great risk. You never know who's around in the office. In public spaces, this is even more of a risk. Things like not activating all the authentication features on a device also makes the organization more vulnerable. Of course, attackers can circumvent many authentication features, but the more that are enabled, the harder the attacker's job is. Also, things like password sharing can be extremely valuable to an attacker. If you're sharing a password with a colleague or a friend, you don't know what that person might do with that information. So IoT and BYOD devices are another huge risk when it comes to hardware access control. So this just means there are more devices with access to or even storing sensitive information. So this is a great risk when the device is lost or stolen, because you don't know who's gaining access to that device, and 65% of companies actually cannot wipe devices remotely. So whoever has access to that device can actually carry out an attack. With more devices, there are more entry points. This can also be unsuspecting devices. Recently, a security camera vendor had 150,000 of their cameras attacked. So many of their clients had their security footage looked at by the attackers. This was some prisons, high schools in America, even Tesla. In other senses, these devices are simply a point of access without sufficient policy enforcements in place. Simply, an attacker can simply infiltrate one device and actually gain access to other devices connected to that same network. So the IoT coffee machine in an office can actually be a point of access for the attacker. These devices also are typically less secure. They aren't always solely used for work purposes, but also personal use. So having too many security features actually disrupts the user's experience. And also, because these devices are deployed to enable remote work, they are often used in less secure environments, whether that be the home or in a public space. And when it comes to hardware security, the physical security that is provided in an office is actually extremely valuable. And in public spaces, this physical security is often not there. The risks of working from home, which is the third vulnerability, are very similar to that of IoT and BYOD, but these risks have proliferated as work from home has become more common. So of course, with COVID last year, 50% of the population was working remotely. So this brings about many risks to the organizations, more employees working in less secure environments, whether again, that be the office, whether that be at home or in a public space. Either way, the environment is less secure, the user is more vulnerable to using an unsecure peripheral and being vulnerable to network vulnerabilities. Organizations do have security features in place for work from home risks, such as VPNs, VDIs, and RDPs. However, when it comes to hardware attacks, these security features actually are ineffective because the endpoint is vulnerable to an attack as long as there's the use of a mouse or a keyboard. The supply chain is the fourth vulnerability. So in general, the supply chain is a huge risk to organizations, impacting more than 50%. However, when it comes to hardware attacks, the supply chain can be used in a number of ways. One of them is as an infiltration method. The attacker might implant a manipulated device at some point in the supply chain. They might actually manipulate a device whilst it's in transit. And the hope is that eventually this device reaches the target organization and is used inside. In other ways, the attacker doesn't actually need to infiltrate the organization, but simply just the supplier, due to the supplier having access to the organization's sensitive information. The complexity of supply chains increases the risk. Nowadays, organizations are using hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers. This means numerous entry points for the attacker, increasing the chances of success. There's also the risk of unknown subcontractors, because oftentimes suppliers will outsource tasks to other third parties, and there is the risk of these parties causing a breach to the organization. You don't know who these subcontractors are, what security features they have in place, where they're located. All of these aspects pose a risk to the organization. Finally, one of the reasons the supply chain is such an attractive attack vector is typically less security features when targeting a highly secured organization. So organizations are deploying, obviously depending on what the operations are, but they often deploy many different security features, and these security solutions are getting stronger, they're getting more effective, and they're making the attacker's job more difficult. So targeting a supply chain that has fewer security features in place is seen as a more attractive attack vector. And all it takes is one supplier in the supply chain to break its security. The fifth vulnerability is that of organizational complexities. So this comes in a range of aspects. So in some cases, the actual operations of the organization can cause security problems. Healthcare, for example, has very time-sensitive operations. So security is actually seen as a hindrance to these operations. It simply delays their processes, and sometimes it's time that they just cannot afford to lose. So security is not prioritized. It's kind of put in the back of the mind to prioritize the healthcare of patients. In other senses, organizational complexities mean an integrated environment. So IT, OT, and IoT devices are becoming increasingly integrated, meaning that an attack actually on one of these environments can impact one of the others. This is because an integrated environment makes lateral movement easier. So an attacker can actually target a non-critical asset, but have this attack can actually impact a critical one. An integrated environment also brings about increased cyber-physical interdependencies. So actually nowadays, a cyber attack can have an effect on the physical equipment being used in an organization. So the Stuxnet attack is a very good example of this, where the worm actually ended up breaking the centrifuges in the nuclear facility. And then finally, with organizational complexities come the risk of a decentralized approach to cybersecurity. So there can be inconsistencies in the organization's approach to cybersecurity, and just like the supply chain, all it takes is the attacker exploiting the most vulnerable part, and this provides the access that they need. A decentralized approach also brings an ineffective response to a cyber incident. If a department doesn't have the sufficient security measures and remediation processes, the mitigation can actually be incomplete and the attack can still remain within the organization in some form. Finally, there's the vulnerability of legacy systems. Legacy systems, of course, were not built with today's cybersecurity needs in mind, so their security features are outdated and they cannot be updated or adapt to the evolving threat landscape. So there is just essentially a major gap in the organization where these legacy systems are. Why this is such a risk is because legacy systems often perform critical roles in an organization. In the energy sector, the banking sector, legacy systems often control operational technology, so an attack will have a significant impact on the organization. Legacy systems pose such a risk because they are often irreplaceable for a number of reasons. One could be that it's extremely costly. Sometimes it's more financially viable to simply continuously update security solutions than it is to actually replace the whole system. In other instances, an organization might be able to actually afford the costs. However, it's just simply too risky to replace the system. Of course, just replacing it will cause disruptions, but there's also the risk of the new system not meeting the same standards of the legacy system due to its specific requirements. So this is where Sepio's hardware access control solution comes in. The HackOne solution provides three main capabilities for organizations. The first is complete visibility. So this is of all assets, that's IT, OT, and IoT devices, operating on the network and USB interfaces. So HackOne will uses machine learning and physical layer fingerprinting to actually engage in device and to analyze device behavior and compare that with known malicious devices. Secondly, HackOne provides organizations with hardware access control through policy enforcement. The system administrator can define a set of rules for the policy to enforce. And then finally, the third capability combines the first two and enables organizations with rogue device mitigation abilities. So with complete visibility and hardware access control, the solution can actually detect and identify hidden implants and manipulated devices and block these devices as soon as they are picked up. So how does it work? On the network side, the HackOne system works on the physical layer and just looks at the activities occurring here. So the HackOne will pull switches with read-only commands, not monitoring any traffic. No baseline is required. So this means that implants that were present before the solution was deployed will still be picked up. And through the system's northbound interface, the solution actually integrates with other existing security software solutions to enact a mitigation process. On the endpoint side, again, the solution works on the physical layer and analyzes device behavior to differentiate between legitimate HIDs and impersonating devices. The solution can actually identify the device's true characteristics and not just detect what the device claims it is. So the business benefits that come with this, of course, the organization will benefit from full visibility. So all assets are accounted for. As I mentioned, the network implants that sit on the physical layer will be detected, as well as the device's true identity. So a device that claims it is something will not get through HackOne. It will detect the true characteristics of the device. Again, the organization can benefit from full control. So through the hardware usage policies, the system administrator can enforce rules that work specifically for the organization and its needs. It's not a one size fits all. It works specifically for the organization itself. With this comes a stronger cybersecurity posture. So of course, the organization has the mitigation is instant and automated, and the remediation process is actually enhanced through HackOne's integration with other existing security software solutions. This stronger cybersecurity posture not only improves reputation, but also makes it easier for the organization to comply with regulations, because the stronger cybersecurity enables the organization to be better equipped. So just about us, Sepio was founded in 2016. It's an Israeli-American company founded by industry veterans who have worked together for more than 29 years. Our headquarters are in Maryland, and research and development centers are in Tel Aviv and Lisbon. HackOne is a SaaS that provides complete visibility, ultimate protection, and rogue device mitigation. We have global clients across a range of verticals, including finance, telecom, utilities, and federal agencies. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Very interesting presentation. I have a question for you. And this is kind of a philosophical question. During the last, you know, I would say few years, and in particular during the last 12 months, we have seen an unprecedented increase in the attack surface. I mean, major reasons for that: a rush, working from home, digitalization process, and many other things, many other components to that, technologically innovation from the criminal side as a major element that this is continuously forgotten by industry and analysis. They try to focus on what the good guys are doing, but there is a lot of obscurity on what the bad guys are doing, and that's an interesting element too. So basically, a substantial increase on the attack surface. Also, new technologies. The predominant use of IoT, industrial IoT, in many critical environments is not helping neither, right? Mm-hmm. So in that environment where, it's becoming almost clear that we cannot stop anymore criminals from breaching organizations. We are seeing that in every kind of organization, left and right, critical infrastructures, healthcare, whatever, with massive budgets. How much level of awareness do you guys see in terms of the need of hardware access control? I mean, it's not just rogue device mitigation, for example, which is one of the key elements, but for example, visibility, the first step. I mean, how much awareness do you see in organizations, in particular in what we call critical infrastructures, like healthcare providers or energy providers, like water systems, all these organizations that you basically support our society, or the critical process of our society? How much awareness do you see about the need of understanding what kind of devices do we have in the network? How to, what are the risks of those devices? How to manage and prevent, risks, or attacks from those devices? How much awareness do you see from these organizations about the need of hardware access control?
So we're seeing an increase in awareness, of course. Part of what we are trying to do is actually increase this awareness across all verticals, of course. Like you said, critical infrastructure, these are organizations that help run society. So they are becoming more aware. Hardware attacks are becoming more commonly reported in the media. Part of the lack of awareness is simply the not reporting a hardware attack when it takes place. A lot of the times it's kind of seen by the organization as embarrassing when it happens. So they try and hide the fact that they've been a victim to a hardware attack. But as, and also, like I said in the presentation, sometimes it's just simply not known. But as these reports are becoming more common, we do see an increase in awareness. And that is also part of what we're trying to do, is just make people more aware of the need for visibility.
Do you see any particular vertical or industry that is, in some way front running this initiative? Because, the OSIL layer 1 has been neglected historically, and forgotten actually. And so some people, when you talk about, hardware attacks, well, most of the stuff is focused on, on layers 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the OSI model, right? So do you see differences in terms of, for example, verticals? I mean, you might say, for example, the healthcare industry or, the utilities are kind of front running this higher awareness initiative. Do you see any difference among industries?
Specifically, I'm not sure if there's a specific difference, but for example, ATMs are very commonly attacked by hardware devices. So the financial sector is quite aware of this. The federal agencies are, of course, very aware of this. A lot of these attack tools actually are based off tools that were part of the NSA's toolkit that Edward Snowden released. So the federal agencies not only are aware, but actually have been using some of these devices for a long time. So federal agencies are aware of this, critical infrastructure. But of course, we're trying to make all industries as aware, because every organization within every industry is vulnerable.
Okay. So thank you very much. This concludes the session. It has been a pleasure having you with us. Stay with us, please, in the APAC, track, and enjoy it. And looking forward to another discussion. Thank you very much, Jessica.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.